Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. My name, yes, it is Daniel Hapney, and I have for you the real story. Tonight's episode, I figured I'd give it a little title for you. You know, I always like to throw it out as a question because I'd like you to question things, and I called it Banksters. Can you count how many times they've committed crimes? How many times in your recent memory? So what I was going to do is just go over some stuff so you understood some of the history that brought us to this economic collapse that we're having. Remember, if you watched the previous shows, especially the first show, second show, third show, 17th show, you would have seen or heard that this was coming and how and why they were perpetrating it. But I wanted to go and review that for you. It's kind of like a little bit of economic collapse in review. So what I have for you, like I say, I was calling it for a while the Banksters. Can we count their crimes? So, I wanted to start off by showing you, and we'll give you a picture. Did you ever hear of the Glass-Steagall Act? Many years ago, during the Great Depression, actually right in the middle of it, about 1933, named after two wonderful congressmen, Mr. Glass and Mr. Steagall, they decided that, that Great Depression was kicked off by what? Speculative investing. These investment banks were part of commercial banks. So they said, hey, we can't have that anymore. We're going to make a wall, a separator, something to separate the commercial bank from the investment bank and also keep them out of insurance, keep them out of derivatives. Well, no, we couldn't have that. Let's move forward. It's 1999. Yes, and we had a president at that point. His name was William Clinton. Remember, he was going to tell you, or your children, after you saw what was in the news, I had to speak to my children when they said, Dad, how come they're all mad at Clinton? And he was saying, well, Monica, oh, no, it depends what your description of is. Well, back in those days anyway, what happened? All through the Bush and Clinton, it actually started before, but the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. So here you go. Okay, just so you know, it's not me. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, and banks were allowed to what? They were allowed to merge, and merge with investment banks and commercial banks, get into insurance, and start selling derivatives. So anyway, that's 1999. Okay, so as you move right along, let's show a picture. Did you ever hear of liar loans? Yeah, do you remember that housing bubble? How did it all go? And oh, by the way, all those derivatives in Glass-Steagall, just in time for stuff like the dot-com bubble and the bursting thereof. Should I mention that? But remember, we'll go back to residential mortgages and stuff, because remember we're at this economic crisis, and the economic crisis we're told is it's a banking crisis, it's a credit crisis, and soon it's going to be what? A currency crisis. That's what they tell you. But anyway, liar loans. Do you remember those? Here's the picture, just so you know, if you want a definition, a liar loan. That's where you didn't have to show that you had income, that you even had employment, and they wouldn't verify it either. So remember, liar loans. You got to remember that. Because remember, we were appraising houses. What else was happening at the same time? Oh, that's right. We had a representative here in Massachusetts, the Lion of the Senate. Edward Kennedy, the one who ran off the bridge at Chappaquiddick and killed who? Bobby Kennedy's secretary. That's right, Mary Jo Kopechne. Who, remember, Bobby, he was the Attorney General. That's the #1 cop in the country, right? And would it be his job to investigate who shot the president? Oh, that was his brother. So the gal who kept all the records didn't know how to swim, but Teddy Kennedy became your senator. So anyway, Ted changed the bankruptcy laws in 2005. Here you go. Just so you know, it's not me. The bankruptcy laws changed. What were they planning? Who was helping Ted figure out that now's a good time to change the bankruptcy laws? So we'll move a little forward or whatever. Do you remember when they lowered interest rates? Yes, you do, don't you? It was called a period of great liquidity. We had the maestro, Alan Greenspan. Yes, and loans. We're going to make, rates go down, 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 down. Keep with me. So then they said, well, with these new lower interest rates, you can afford a more expensive house. And they got everyone to buy houses. And they told you that your house was a bank account, an asset that you could draw from. You could get a home equity loan. That's right. And you wonder now, you found out about liar loans, and you found out that they would give people more than the appraised value of the home, and they'd give these loans to people who couldn't even, show that they had income. And you ask why? We're going to take you down the road because these banksters, once again, the crime started with paying off your congressmen and senators so that they'd change the Glass-Steagall Act and repeal it. Then they went to saying, okay, once again, it's okay to do liar loans. We don't need any verification. Then the next thing they did is they said, we're going to bundle these loans and we're going to make them into vehicles. Because now Glass-Steagall was gone, we could now have vehicles that we could do what? Create derivatives from. So you've probably heard of companies like AIG. the quote insurance company. They'd take a whole pile of loans and they'd wrap an insurance policy around it. That's an insurance policy in case those people default and don't pay the loans. Remember that later on in the program. So this insurance policy, now they could turn around and sell those bundled loans out to people. And those people they sold them to banks who would do what? Who would create derivatives based on the income streams. I know you say, how do you do that? Well, let's take a look. Here's the pictures and stuff. First off, there's AIG with their insurance stuff. Just so you know, they do have an insurance group, and this is what they did. And they were not the only one. But the other thing you should learn about is mortgage-backed securities. Go ahead. Read. What is a mortgage-backed security? Very interesting, huh? And then we had credit default swaps. And don't leave out collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. I provided you images for all this. Why? Because you got to realize this is all the stuff that the bankers did that they couldn't do before. And by the way, it was a felony to do it before. You would have done jail time, big time. But okay, generations had passed and everybody forgot about the Great Depression and how the bankers took money from the people then, and what happened to the world shortly after. Was it worldwide? Is this a worldwide issue? So it's rather interesting anyway. So then you find out that these people who were doing these, putting all the packages together, making these derivatives, selling them off to what? Your pension plan? That's right, for you police out there and for you firemen and teachers and all you people with pensions, county pensions and state pensions. What's in your pension plan? They always ask, what's in your wallet, right? I ask, what's in your pension plan? So with that, and let me show you a little bit. This was Matt Taibbi, who's a writer for the Rolling Stone. Here's a little clip so you have an idea of the people you were dealing with. He's going to talk about Goldman Sachs.
Hi, my name is Matt Taibbi. I'm a reporter for Rolling Stone magazine, and I'm here to talk about the story behind my story in this month's issue, The Great American Bubble Machine. In the story, we focus on 6 bubbles, but we're primarily focusing on 3 bubbles that happened in the last 2 decades. There was the internet bubble, the housing/credit bubble that everybody knows about, and there's a third one that most people don't really know a whole lot about, and that's the commodities bubble. And that's when gas prices shot up to over $4 a gallon. It had absolutely nothing to do with supply and demand. Supply was actually up worldwide. Demand was rising at a slower rate than supply. And it was banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley that were primarily responsible for that. Actually, last summer, every barrel of oil was traded 27 times before it was actually delivered to a customer that consumed it. And what's important to understand about this is that it shows pretty much everybody is affected by the behavior of banks like Goldman Sachs. One of the things that's a recurring theme in this story is that Goldman and banks like Goldman, they're expert at going after these big pools of investor capital. And what they do is they get these large institutional investors. They had them investing in the internet, mortgage-backed securities, and they're also the biggest consumers of commodities futures, of oil futures. The big scam here is that they found ways to take a whole bunch of crap, right, slap it with a AAA rating, and sell it to a bunch of big institutional investors. The important thing to remember is that when they designed this market to trade commodities, and it's not just oil, but any commodity, that's corn, wheat, natural gas, there was a law that was passed in the 30s, the Commodity Futures Exchange Act. Back then, people understood that if there were too many speculators in the market, that speculators would begin to affect prices artificially. So they placed limits on how many speculators there could be on the market. What happened in the last 2 decades is that banks like Goldman Sachs very quietly and more or less secretly got exemptions to this rule. They slowly began to overtake real supply and demand in the market, and what happened last summer is we sort of reached the point where the speculators dominated the market, and that's why prices now have very little to do with real supply and demand as a result of that change.
The reason I brought Goldman Sachs into the discussion is because at the same time that they were selling these mortgage-backed securities and CDOs, okay, credit default swaps, and collateralized debt obligations, at the same time they were selling them to your pension plan. That's right, Mr. Policeman, Mr. Fireman, Mr. County Worker, State Worker, Town Worker. As they were selling them into your pension plan, they were also short selling them. There's some homework for tonight. What does short selling mean? So they represent them to you as AAA rated because they get insurance policies. Remember AIG? But then what are they doing? On the backside, they're shorting them in the future. Rather interesting how these crooks work. And meanwhile, you know, who runs the Securities and Exchange Commission, the watchdog group of the government? Boy, they're all Goldman Sachs people. Let's not leave off Morgan, you know, what's it, J.P. Morgan Chase and all that. So anyway, as we turn around, we're selling them as AAA rated, you know, securities and derivatives thereof. So here's one for you. We talked about them selling them short. What happens if someone was to default on those loans? You say, well, the banks are going to be hurting. Well, they really? Because they have insurance. That's right, AIG. And the banks collect 80% of the loan value. Rather interesting. You thought they were hurting. So you probably remember TARP. There's the picture. Okay, remember TARP? TARP was the Troubled, you know, Asset Recovery Program or something, right? Where the government was going to take these crud assets and give them full face value for them, and then charge you the interest, charge you the taxes to pay them back. You're guaranteeing them. So who was the biggest, who's the biggest money person for Obama, or number one or two? Could it have been Goldman Sachs? Gee, same thing with Bush. You thought you had changed because you were taking hopium. You rolled up your sleeve, you injected the hopium. I love Democrats, I need some opium. Oh, and then it's like, Bush is going to save us, I love Republicans. You people don't realize it's not about you. Maybe you do. What am I saying? I don't know what you realize, but I do know this. When we start being worried about the party, whether it's Republican or Democrat, instead of worrying about our family and or America or our country, bad things can happen. So anyway, keeping count on how these, you know, criminals did what they did. They're called banksters. This is nothing new. This is what's happened in history many times. Okay, so they did all this, and they could move the money through the globalist banks. They even sold these derivatives and stuff to foreigners. You'll find that the big banks like Deutsche Bank in Germany, Societe Generale in France, okay, over in China, gee, who's got all this paper that was created? The interesting thing was when they made derivatives, they were able to sell everybody, what, a piece of your mortgage. This is why there's foreclosure gate, because, gee, do you have that mortgage, or do you just have a piece of it? Can you foreclose on that home, or do you just have a little piece of it? Why this is interesting is because during this whole time, the controlled mainstream media, once again owned and run by the bankers, you may think it's a conspiracy, but I think you'll find it's a fact, that these media corporations were selling you what? They were selling you television programming. What was the TV show that was on? Was it called Flip This House? Design on a Dime? Designed to Sell? Is it just me, or has your memory been, you know, eroded by the chemical attack of the fluoride in your water? Could be. Just a thought. Don't know about it. Maybe you're on Prozac and you don't care. Maybe you're on Ritalin and, you know, you're giving some to your kids. But once again, the media at the same time was telling you it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, that you should borrow money against your house because you can pull the equity out of your house. You should get into greater amounts of debt. At the same time, they've got liar loans, and they're bumping up the cost of housing with the cheap money, knowing full well that they were the ones who funded the change in the bankruptcy laws. This is like playing chess. They were setting all these pieces up. So then what happens? Once again, we get the TARP, the Troubled Asset Recovery Program, right? And what happens? The money gets funneled through AIG, and the foreign banks get your tax dollars. Don't you feel good? Isn't that good for your grandchildren? Okay, so the thing that really, you know, if all this isn't enough crime in and of itself, then you find out that our Congress and our Senate do what? Voice votes. Aye or nay. That way they don't have to record the congressman's name, do they? Or the senator's name. Well, recently they just did that. And that vote came up. Why? Because they wanted to change the law for notarizing papers. So that if I was in Florida, I could notarize a paper and Massachusetts would have to accept it. This is important because it just happened about a week ago. And why it's important is it would allow all the bump foreclosures going through. The reason, once again, the foreclosures were frozen and stalled is because the people foreclosing didn't have clear title to the property. Because that had to be a notarized document recorded at the Registry of Deeds. If an attorney's watching the television show and cares about his family and his grandchildren, maybe wants to come on and help the viewers understand how that program works. But once again, here's your Congress and your senators bought off by your banksters trying to change the law, and so Our great eminent, authority man, the Obama man, what does he do? He pocket vetoes it. I did a veto, stuck it in my pocket. Did a little veto, stuck it in my pocket. Veto, pocket. Put my jacket on, jacket off. I could go through the whole thing. Do you even know about Jean-Claude Jacquetti?